Alright, it took a few years of trial and error and several trans-cooler combinations, but I think I finally got the trans-cooling situation figured out in the GMC. Now for context, this truck has a 4L60E transmission, which is a 4-speed overdrive transmission with a locking torque converter, and it's obviously not in the original vehicle. It has been resto-modded into this 1968 GMC. But given the cause of the problem, I wanted to share what it was and how I solved it, because I'm imagining this is probably pretty common. And this problem plagued the truck for probably 2 years, maybe closer to 3. And it was whenever we were messing with that 78 C20 that I was looking at it and I was just getting frustrated with the whole thing, because I was thinking, how can I have this transmission with 3/8 cooler lines, the deep pan because it came out of a 4-wheel drive, a locking torque converter, and an auxiliary cooler, when this C20 had 5/16 lines, a shallow pan, no locking torque converter, and just the cooler and the radiator, and somehow that thing from the factory obviously never had chronic transmission overheating. And so it was really frustrating me, and the only difference I could come up with was, well, this has overdrive and this doesn't. What difference could that possibly make? So I found a PDF document all about the 4L60E transmission, and that's kind of where I started putting this together. So here I pulled these excerpts from it, and here we can see when fluid temperatures exceed 275 degrees Fahrenheit, the PCM commands the torque converter clutch, the TCC, apply at all times in 4th gear. Okay, so the torque converter clutch and 4th gear are somehow involved in this. These are both things that C20 didn't have. Applying the TCC reduces fluid temperatures created by the fluid coupling in the torque converter. So that was kind of the smoking gun here, that the torque converter is what really is creating the vast majority of the heat in the transmission. And then here, later in the document, it also says, when the transmission fluid temperature is above approximately 275 degrees Fahrenheit, the torque converter clutch is applied at all times in 4th gear to help reduce transmission fluid temperatures. So this is the problem I was having in the truck. Now, it never got to 275. I wouldn't let it get that hot. But as soon as I lifted off the gas and the torque converter locked up, then the transmission would come back down to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So, looking more in the document, found out some other interesting things. There are 2 fluid circuits in an automatic transmission. There is the high pressure circuit, which is where the line pressure is measured from, and that's actually what applies the clutches and the bands in the transmission. Then there's the lube circuit, and that is the fluid that actually lubricates all the bearings and bushings and planetary gears, and it is only that fluid that actually goes through the cooler. So not all the fluid that the pump moves gets cooled. So I felt that was a pretty important thing to know here. And you can see how the fluid comes into the transmission and it lubricates all the stuff that moves, but it's not actually applying any of the clutches in the transmission. So it goes through the cooler and gets cooled before it goes and lubricates all of the bearings and gears. So there's also several of these charts going around. Don't know how accurate they are, but anyways, it's kind of showing the average mileage that the transmission will last roughly based on the average fluid temperature, and I just threw this in to show that it is incredibly important to not let a transmission run hot. And at one point I read this rule here. I don't know if it's actually true or not, but it was something like every 20 degrees Fahrenheit over 200 degrees Fahrenheit reduces transmission life by half. So don't know if that's true or not, but I just wanted to throw this in here to show that, once you start getting around 200 and above 200 degrees is when you can start having problems with the transmission fluid getting too hot. So here is kind of heading towards the final setup that the truck has now. So this would be kind of like how the factory had it, like that C20. Fluid comes out, goes through the radiator, the cooler and the radiator, and back to the transmission. The way I have it set up is fluid comes out, it hits this thermostat, and then it goes and splits off, where part of the fluid goes through the cooler and the radiator, and the other part of the fluid goes through the auxiliary cooler, and then it comes back through the thermostat into the transmission. But even with this setup, and you can see how massive this transcooler is. I think this was the biggest just generic transcooler I could find. And it's 8.5 by 22 inches long, and it's over an inch deep, and it's a 13 row, I think it's called a waffle style cooler, maybe. Anyways, it's supposed to be super efficient because the fluid has to zigzag through it, and it provides a lot more surface area than a tube and fin cooler. But you can see that's the width of the cooler versus the width of the radiator. And then it's still using the cooler and the radiator. But this setup still could not keep the transmission from overheating. Fourth gear, as soon as the torque converter would unlock, the transmission temp would start climbing until I let off the gas. So we still had something going on here. Here I was just showing how the thermostat worked. It had 2 inlets, 2 outlets. And so when fluid temperature is below 180 degrees, it can kind of either passively go through the cooler or loop through here and go back to the transmission, but it basically isn't forced to go through the coolers. Once the fluid temperature gets to 180 degrees and above, then the thermostat closes and it actually forces all the fluid to go through the coolers. So here was just kind of some data I remembered off the top of my head. The original gear set the truck had when it was first put together was a 308 rear gear. And driving down the highway at about 75 miles an hour, that put the motor at roughly 2,000 RPM with the torque converter locked. When the torque converter unlocked, it'd come up to about 2,400. Now, you can probably tell where this is going, but I ended up putting the original diff back in the truck, and that diff had a 354 rear gear, and that jumped the RPM up to where now it was running about 2,400, maybe closer to 2,500 RPM with the torque converter locked. And really, I don't notice it unlocking the torque converter. Usually if it needs to do something, it just downshifts to third. And then also, here was this clip of us towing the Blazer back.
I would have it. Absolutely. Remember when we were talking coming down, you're like, this hill's gonna be a bit. Yeah. Well, here we are on the hill. Sorry, guy.
And this was pulling this hill in second gear, towing the Blazer and the trailer, which I'm guessing is about 6,000 pounds. The Blazer is not real light. And transmission got up to about 180, 185, best I remember, and we were pulling 2,800 RPM. And clearly, I mean, it was working perfect, absolutely no problems. And with the current setup, 2,500 RPM with the torque converter unlocked is seems to be about the limit where the transmission is able to maintain its temperature, and I'm going to explain why I think that is. So, what I believe is going on here, just through the research I did and reasoning, is if you increase the engine RPM, you're going to increase the RPM of the transmission pump. And if you do that, you're going to increase how much fluid it's running. And if you increase the flow rate, you're going to improve the overall effectiveness of the system. Or at least that's the theory. But I wanted to be able to justify that thought. So buckle up, because here's where the rubber meets the road. So these are just some heat equations, and I'll try and explain this as best I can. Basically, Q is the rate of heat transfer, so it's how much heat are we moving in a given amount of time. That's the specific heat, that's constant, that will not change. And then the mass flow rate is what we're concerned about, how much fluid is it moving, and then that's just the temperature difference. So the rate of heat transfer, as far as we're concerned here, is not going to be changing. We're just assuming the transmission is making as much heat as it's going to make given the driving condition. So that is going to have to equal the amount of heat that is being removed from the transmission by the cooling system in order for the transmission to not increase in temperature. So that equation is going to equal our flow rate times our specific heat times the change in temperature of the fluid. So the thing to note here is that Q is going to be staying constant here, like I said, because it's making the heat it's going to make. This is also constant. So the thing we are changing here is the flow rate. And for the sake of this, we can either increase or decrease it. But changing the flow rate up, increasing the flow rate is going to mean that this number here is going to have to decrease in order for for this equation to hold true. And that seems really counterintuitive when you kind of just glance at it. It's like, okay, increasing the flow rate is going to mean that the change in temperature is less. That's going to mean that our inlet temperature to the coolers is going to be staying the same the whole time because our heat load is staying the same. So the only thing that can change here is that our outlet temperature from the coolers is going to increase. So that may make you think that, okay, well, the system isn't working as good because our outlet temperature is increasing, but that isn't necessarily true. We increased the flow rate. So with the increased flow rate and the increase in temperature of the outlet has to happen in order for it to still be removing the same amount of heat. So that's kind of counterintuitive, but it's what holds true here. Alright, here is a terrible visual to try and convey this idea. So imagine you have a loop with a bunch of carts on it. At one end of the loop, there is a conveyor belt that is constantly depositing dirt into the carts, and at the other end of the loop is where they are dumping this dirt. So if the carts are going real slow, they're going to be spending a longer amount of time at the conveyor before they move on. So they're going to end up getting fairly full. And now if you speed up the carts so that they're going around the circuit quicker, they're going to be spending less time at the conveyor before they pass it. So they're going to end up being less full than they were before. So that's kind of how the water temp works. Because the water's spending less time in the heat exchanger, it's not going to increase in temperature as much. But the key thing here is, in this analogy, the conveyor is still moving the same amount of dirt the entire time, regardless of how fast the carts are going. So the same amount of dirt is getting moved from one end of the loop to the other. This is because, despite that the carts are being filled to a lower level when they are moving quicker, they end up making more passes past the conveyor in a given amount of time. And so this idea holds true with the cooler. The water spends less time in the cooler. A specific piece of water spends less time in the cooler, meaning that it gains less energy. And so it's not going to increase in temperature as much. But because the flow rate is higher, that bit of water is making more passes through the cooler in a given amount of time. So that's how we end up maintaining the amount of energy we are removing from the system. And the reason that is an important thing to note is this figure, our temperature difference across the cooler, is going to decrease. And so this equation that looks real similar is used to size heat exchangers, and a cooler, a radiator, all of that is nothing but a type of heat exchanger. So this, again, this is our heat load. It's going to be staying the same. this figure here is the heat transfer coefficient, and for the sake of this, we're just going to assume it stays the same. Realistically, this would increase a little bit because we're increasing the convection inside the cooler. The area, we're not changing, but there is this here, which is temperature dependent. It is the logarithmic mean temperature, which is shown here, and it is the just the differences between the inlet air and oil temperature and the inlet or the outlet air and oil temperature. And the air is the air going across the coolers. So this is just a figure that relates those four temperatures together. And the important thing to note is if this figure here decreases, then this increases. So just like with this equation, Q is going to stay the same. We're assuming this is going to stay the same. This increases, so area has to decrease. And this area is the required area that this equation says we need, the surface area of the cooler. So if this equation is saying that we need a smaller cooler, but obviously in the real world the cooler isn't going to just shrink, the cooler is going to stay the same size, but if it's saying we need a smaller one, then we've made the system more efficient. Now the cooler we have is oversized. And then if we flip this whole thing around, we decrease the mass flow rate. Well, the only thing that can change again is this figure, and it is going to increase. And if this increases, this figure will decrease, and to make up for that, we're going to have a larger surface area as far as the cooler goes. And if that exceeds the cooler we have, then our rate of heat transfer that's being removed by the cooler is not going to be greater or even equal to the heat that's coming out of the transmission, and then it's just going to continually increase in temperature, which was the problem that I was having. So basically what happened is by changing the rear gear, even though I was running the same speed, changing the rear gear meant that the motor was running a higher RPM, and I increased the flow rate of the fluid through the transmission because the transmission pump was spinning quicker, which dropped this figure down, raised this one up, and resulted in a lower required surface area for the coolers, which meant that I improved the effectiveness of the system, and I happened to do so more than what was actually needed, meaning that it could maintain temperature. So just to kind of convey this a little bit better, I put this Excel sheet together. So anything in green is not changing. So our inlet fluid temp is not changing because we're assuming, again, the transmission is making whatever heat it's going to make. The outlet air temp, I'm assuming, isn't going to change because, again, we're assuming the cooler is removing whatever heat it's going to remove. And inlet air temp, we're just assuming that based on driving conditions and whatever. And so here you can see the mass flow rate increasing, 1 through 7. And none of this is actual data. I just threw numbers in here just for the sake of demonstration. So mass flow rate is what we're changing. And then everything else is what changed as a result. So you can see increasing the mass flow rate, our outlet fluid temp starts increasing. It starts creeping up. And you look at this and you say, wow, we're hardly even losing any temperature. But that's true, but it's because we're flowing so much fluid through the cooler. We're still removing the same amount of heat from that fluid. We're just not dropping it in temperature much because any one, specific part of fluid isn't spending a whole lot of time in the cooler. But overall, we're still removing the same amount of heat. And that's a difficult thing to describe, but that's the concept that's happening here. So as this starts increasing, you can see the difference in temperature decreases between the two. 180 to 179 is considerably less than 180 to 155. So as the difference between these two decreases, this figure here is increasing, and the result is that our required cooler area starts decreasing. So, here with a mass flow rate of 1, we would need a cooler with this surface area. Well, if we jack the flow rate up, well, now we only need a cooler with this surface area. It's less. But if we still have this giant cooler with the flow rate with this higher flow rate, then the system is going to be able to reject more heat than is being put into it, which is good. So just basically in summary with that, increase in flow causes an increase in outlet temp, which causes an increase in the logarithmic mean temperature differential, which causes a decrease in the required area. Okay, well, hopefully most of that made sense. If it didn't, I can try and clarify further down below, or if you think I didn't cover something entirely correct, feel free to let me know, just because I did learn all of this recently and am by no means an expert in it. But I can't help but wonder how many other people have probably had this exact same issue. In my case, it was because I put an overdrive transmission with a gear ratio that was designed for a 3-speed without overdrive. And similarly, I imagine you could have this exact same problem if you put oversized tires on something, considerably oversized tires on something that really lowered the RPM on the highway. I think it would have the exact same effect. So hopefully this can, help someone out if they're having an issue with it, because this took a little bit of figuring out on my end. But anyways, I thought it was real interesting and wanted to share all of it, and I'll appreciate any further input on it. Okay, well, I haven't been documenting a whole lot of what I've been doing just because I've been trying to get it done, and I figure it's just easier to show the end product. Here is the bracket there holding the thermostat and such. So I got that in, but a deal I thought was kind of funny is, so the transmission holds up the back of the motor, right? And so usually what Nathan and I have done is you just take a big block of wood and put it between, the block or the head and the firewall, and that keeps the motor from flopping back. Well, on this, there's a whole lot of stuff going on back here and really couldn't do that. So what I did is I have this chain here that bolts to the cylinder head and wraps around the master cylinder bracket deal that I made. But if you notice, it's still quite loose. And why it's loose and why the motor never fell, and what I think is kind of funny, is the exhaust is holding it up. I mean, because there's nothing else that could possibly be holding up the motor other than the exhaust. So kudos to whoever welded this together back in the day, because it's apparently pretty stout. Alright, so now that the rag box isn't on fire and I hit my head on the bumper, what I was going to show is this little thing I was doing to measure the bolt holes, because I'm making a bracket to hold the transmission thermostat. And I need to get the pattern for the motor mount bolts right here. And so what I did to do that I thought was kind of clever, because it made it really easy, and I did it on the thermostat too, is up there, those two, not the lower ones, but the two upper holes is what I'm gonna bolt this bracket to. Those are the holes for the fuel pump, except this is a Vortec block, but they put the holes there and threaded them. I stuck this piece of paper up there over the bolt holes, and I got one of them threaded in, and then I threaded the other one in, and so the bolt will pretty much cut out a circle as it threads in. And the first bolt will hold it, and then you can put in however many else you need, and then you just come over here, line up your holes wherever you want them, mark them, and then drill them, and it'll come out exactly where you want them. So I thought that was kind of cool. Alright, so there's the lines that come out to the two unions, so you can just undo those right there instead of having to mess with the not quick connects. And then factory line just runs up, those fittings that hopefully won't leak anymore. That one's the hot side with the sending unit in it. And then matching up with the arrows on the thermostat. And then out here, I put the T this way so that hopefully it splits the way the fluid goes as opposed to just going straight across like that one. So the fluid comes in, it splits. That one goes to the bottom of the radiator, that one goes to the auxiliary cooler, and then they both come in and go back out. So hopefully that'll work just dandy.